Inside the deadliest arena ever built, nearly 500,000 human beings lost their lives for the entertainment of a crowd that cheered louder with every drop of blood spilled. How did a structure built by slaves, funded by the plunder of a conquered nation, become the single most enduring symbol of an empire that ruled the known world? What specific combination of engineering genius, political calculation, and raw human cruelty allowed this arena to operate for nearly 4 centuries without ever fully losing its grip on the Roman public? And why did a building designed to celebrate absolute imperial power eventually collapse into a quarry, stripped bare by the very descendants of the people who once filled its stands, screaming for more? This is the complete story of the Roman Colosseum, the bloodiest stage in human history. The story begins not with triumph, but with disaster. In the year 64 AD, a catastrophic fire tore through the city of Rome, destroying entire neighborhoods and leaving thousands of ordinary citizens homeless. The emperor, at the time, Nero, responded to this human tragedy in a way that would haunt his reputation for centuries. Rather than rebuilding for the people, he seized much of the newly cleared land at the heart of the city for himself. On that land, Nero constructed an enormous private palace complex known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, complete with an artificial lake, sprawling gardens, and a colossal bronze statue of himself standing over 100 feet tall. To the ordinary citizens of Rome, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Their emperor had taken a moment of collective suffering and transformed it into a monument to his own personal vanity. Nero was far from the first Roman emperor to recognize the political value of grand public spectacle. His predecessor, Caligula, had already staged lavish and extravagantly costly games decades earlier, reportedly bankrupting significant portions of the imperial treasury in his own relentless pursuit of public spectacle and personal popularity, establishing a dangerous precedent that later Flavian emperors would study carefully. Determined to avoid Caligula's same catastrophic financial and political mistakes. When Nero died by suicide in 68 AD, Rome plunged into a brutal year of civil war, with rival generals fighting for control of the empire in rapid and bloody succession. It was Vespasian, a general with no aristocratic bloodline and no natural claim to legitimacy, who eventually emerged victorious from this chaos and founded a new ruling dynasty, the Flavians. Vespasian understood something crucial about political survival that Nero never had. An emperor without inherited legitimacy needed the love of the Roman people far more than he needed a golden palace. So Vespasian made a deliberate and calculated decision. He would drain Nero's private lake, the very centerpiece of the hated Golden House, and build something entirely different in its place. Where Nero had built a monument to himself, Vespasian would build a monument to Rome itself, a massive public arena that would belong not to one man, but to every citizen of the empire. This decision alone reveals something essential about how Roman power actually worked. Legitimacy was never simply inherited. It had to be earned, performed, and constantly renewed in front of a watching public. Vespasian had spent decades as a career military commander before becoming emperor, and he understood the psychology of ordinary soldiers and ordinary citizens far better than the aristocratic elite who had traditionally ruled Rome from birth. He recognized that a general who had clawed his way to power through a brutal civil war could not simply rely on bloodline or tradition to secure his family's future. He needed a permanent, visible, physical symbol that the Flavian dynasty existed for the people, not against them. The funding for this ambitious project came from an equally significant source. Vespasian had recently crushed a major Jewish rebellion in Judea, and the spoils of that brutal conquest, along with the labor of thousands of Jewish prisoners of war, financed and built the new arena. An inscription discovered centuries later at the site confirms this directly, stating that the structure was built using proceeds from the spoils of war, a permanent physical reminder that this monument entertainment was born from military conquest and human suffering from its very first stone. Construction began around 70 or 72 AD, and the sheer scale of the undertaking was staggering for its time. Roman engineers designed a structure using an elliptical shape roughly 620 feet long and 513 feet wide. The building rose 4 stories into the sky. Constructed primarily from travertine limestone, quarried from Tivoli, roughly 20 miles away, and transported along a specially built road to handle the immense weight of the stone blocks. Historians estimate that construction of the Colosseum required the labor of tens of thousands of workers over roughly a decade, including skilled Roman engineers and architects, professional stonemasons, and an enormous workforce of unskilled laborers, many of them the very Jewish prisoners of war brought back from the destruction of Jerusalem. Some modern historians estimate that as many as 100,000 Jewish captives may have been forcibly transported to Rome following the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, with a significant portion of that captive population put directly to work, quarrying, hauling, and shaping the very stones that would form the arena's outer walls. The largest travertine blocks used in the foundation and lower arcades weighed several tons each, and moving them from the quarry at Tivoli into the heart of Rome required specially reinforced wagons, teams of oxen, and a purpose-built road wide enough and stable enough to bear the extraordinary weight without collapsing. Roman engineers secured many of these massive stone blocks together, using iron clamps sealed with molten lead, a construction technique so effective that portions of the original structure have survived nearly 2,000 years of earthquakes, weathering, and deliberate human destruction. The building's numbered entrances, 76 of them for ordinary paying spectators, alongside additional private entrances reserved for the emperor and Rome's elite, were designed to allow as many as 50,000 people to enter and find their assigned seats within a matter of minutes. Beyond the arena's own walls, the streets immediately surrounding the Colosseum developed into a bustling and highly profitable commercial district in their own right, with food vendors, wine sellers, souvenir merchants selling small terracotta figurines of famous gladiators, and even fortune tellers offering predictions about the outcome of upcoming matches, all competing for the attention and coin of the enormous crowds gathering before and after each day's spectacle. This surrounding commercial ecosystem meant that the Colosseum's economic influence over the city extended well beyond the arena's own formal walls, generating employment and revenue for thousands of ordinary Roman families whose livelihoods depended directly or indirectly on the continued popularity of the games themselves, creating yet another powerful practical incentive for successive emperors to keep the spectacle running continuously across the generations. Spectators carried small-numbered tokens made of bone, ivory, or pottery, functioning essentially as ancient tickets, indicating precisely which entrance, staircase, and seating section each individual was permitted to use, an astonishingly modern system of crowd management for a structure built nearly 2,000 years before the invention of electronic ticketing. This same efficient design allowed the entire massive crowd to evacuate the building again in only a few minutes, once the day's spectacle had ended, using a network of internal staircases and exit passages that architectural historians today still refer to using the original Latin term, vomitoria, describing the way crowds were essentially disgorged rapidly out of the structure. Roman engineers used an innovative combination of materials, including concrete, brick, and stone, layering them with remarkable structural sophistication that allowed the building to support its own colossal weight while remaining stable for centuries. Interestingly, the name most of the world knows this building by today, the Colosseum, was not actually its original Roman title at all. Ancient Romans themselves referred to the structure formally as the Flavian amphitheater, honoring the ruling dynasty that had built it. The now famous nickname Colosseum only emerged centuries later during the medieval period, and it did not originally refer to the arena's own considerable size at all. It instead referred to the enormous bronze colossus statue of Nero that still stood nearby, later modified and rededicated to the sun god, which continued towering beside the arena for centuries after the emperor who commissioned it had died in disgrace. Over time, as the statue itself eventually disappeared and was lost to history, the nickname Colosseum gradually detached itself from the vanished statue and permanently attached itself instead to the massive amphitheater standing beside it, a linguistic accident that has shaped how the entire modern world refers to this building ever since. The lower three levels featured a repeating sequence of arches framed by different classical column styles, Doric on the ground floor, Ionic on the second, and Corinthian on the third, a deliberate architectural statement showcasing Roman mastery of Greek artistic tradition while surpassing it in scale. Beneath the arena floor itself, engineers constructed an elaborate underground network known as the hypogeum, a labyrinth of tunnels, cages, and mechanical lift systems that would later become central to the deadly spectacle staged above. This hypogeum contained as many as 80 vertical shafts, each equipped with wooden platforms and counterweighted pulley systems capable of hoisting caged animals, scenery, and even condemned prisoners directly up through trapdoors into the arena, seemingly out of nowhere in front of a stunned and roaring crowd. The sophistication of this hidden machinery meant that Roman spectators rarely knew what would emerge next from beneath the sand-covered floor, a deliberate design choice that transformed every single show into an unpredictable and genuinely terrifying theatrical experience. Modern engineers who have studied the surviving hypogeum remains estimate that operating this vast underground machinery during a single day of games required the coordinated labor of dozens of workers, stagehands, and animal handlers working simultaneously beneath the arena floor, hauling ropes, releasing counterweights, and guiding terrified animals through the dark maze of tunnels toward their designated lift shaft at precisely the correct moment in the day's carefully planned program. This entire underground operation had to function with theatrical precision, since a mistimed animal release or a jammed lift mechanism could ruin the carefully constructed illusion the audience above had come specifically to witness, meaning that the men working in the hypogeum's darkness carried responsibility for the show's success that was every bit as demanding as the visible performers fighting above them in the sunlight. Regarding the reported naval battles staged within the arena itself, considerable modern scholarly debate continues over whether the Colosseum's hypogeum, once constructed, could have physically accommodated full-scale flooding after the underground network of animal chambers and lift mechanisms was completed. Since the elaborate wooden and mechanical infrastructure installed beneath the arena floor would likely have been severely damaged or destroyed by sustained direct exposure to standing water. Many modern historians now believe that the large-scale naumachie witnessed by Titus's opening crowds may have actually been staged before the hypogeum's more elaborate wooden machinery was fully installed, or alternatively that later reports of flooding within the completed arena were exaggerated or conflated with separate naval spectacles staged elsewhere in Rome using purpose-built basins specifically designed for that singular purpose. Whatever the precise engineering reality behind these dramatic accounts, ancient Roman audiences themselves clearly believed and thoroughly enjoyed the idea that their arena could be transformed within hours from a sand-covered battlefield into a full naval war zone and back again, a testament to just how completely Roman spectacle culture had convinced itself that virtually any feat of engineering ambition remained achievable in pursuit of ever more spectacular public entertainment. Above ground, Roman engineers solved a problem that had plagued large gathering spaces for centuries: how to protect tens of thousands of spectators from the brutal Mediterranean sun during hours of continuous spectacle. Their solution was the velarium, a massive retractable awning system made of canvas sailcloth, operated by a specially trained team of sailors from the Roman imperial fleet, who used an intricate system of ropes, masts, and rigging to extend and retract the shade canopy as needed. These sailors were specifically stationed at a nearby naval base for this exact purpose, since their professional expertise handling large sail rigging aboard warships translated directly into the specialized skill required to manage the Colosseum's massive canvas canopy, stretched across more than 160 freestanding wooden masts positioned around the building's uppermost outer rim. Modern historians and engineers still debate the exact total seating capacity of the completed structure, with ancient sources and modern archaeological reconstruction producing estimates ranging anywhere from around 50,000 up to as many as 80,000 spectators, depending on exactly how tightly Roman audiences were expected to be seated across the arena's tiered marble and wooden benches. Even using the more conservative estimate, the Colosseum's seating capacity would have made it comparable in scale to many of the largest professional sports stadiums built anywhere in the world today, an extraordinary engineering achievement for a structure completed using entirely ancient construction methods, without any of the steel reinforcement or modern machinery available to contemporary architects. The seating itself was organized with unmistakable and deliberate social precision, This was not simply a building for entertainment, it was a physical map of the entire Roman social hierarchy, carved permanently into stone. The emperor and Rome's most powerful senators occupied the lowest tier, closest to the bloodshed, in a position of maximum visibility and maximum status. Above them sat the wealthy equestrian class, then ordinary citizens, then the poor, and finally, at the very highest and most distant tier, women and slaves were required to sit together as far from the action as physically possible. Every single person entering the Colosseum instantly understood, through nothing more than where they were permitted to sit, exactly where they stood, within the rigid structure of Roman society, a silent but unmistakable lesson repeated at every single show. The emperor's own personal viewing box, known as the pulvinar, occupied a specially elevated and separated position along the arena's northern side, granting him not only the clearest possible view of the action below, but also maximum visibility to the tens of thousands of spectators seated across from him, who could watch their ruler's own reactions to the spectacle almost as closely as they watched the combat itself. Even the arena floor's own name carried deliberate meaning. The Latin word arena, meaning sand, referred specifically to the thick layer of fine sand spread across the wooden floor covering the hypogeum below, chosen deliberately for its practical ability to absorb the enormous quantities of blood spilled during a single day's events, and it is from this single practical Latin word that the modern English word arena directly and permanently derives. Vespasian did not live to see his monumental project completed. He died in 79 AD, and it fell to his son and successor, Titus, to formally open the arena to the Roman public the following year, in 80 AD. Titus understood exactly what was expected of him. To secure his own legitimacy as the new emperor, he needed to give the Roman people something they would never forget, and he delivered spectacularly. The inaugural games lasted an extraordinary 100 consecutive days, an unprecedented display of imperial generosity and violence combined into a single continuous public celebration. According to ancient sources, as many as 9,000 animals were slaughtered during these opening games alone, including exotic and terrifying creatures imported from across the entire known world: lions, elephants, rhinoceroses, and bears, creatures most ordinary Romans had never seen and would never see again in their lifetimes. Beyond these famous headline species, Roman records and archaeological animal bone deposits recovered near the Colosseum also confirm the presence of giraffes, hippopotamuses, ostriches, wild boar, and even the now completely extinct North African elephant subspecies, a population hunted so intensively for arena spectacle across successive centuries that many modern historians believe Roman demand for arena animals directly contributed to its eventual total extinction. For ordinary Roman citizens, many of whom would never travel more than a few days' journey from the city of their birth in their entire lifetime, the Colosseum's animal hunts represented the only realistic opportunity they would ever have to see these extraordinary creatures from distant corners of the known world, transforming the arena into something functioning almost like an ancient combination of natural history museum and public zoo. However violent and fatal that particular exhibition ultimately proved for every animal involved. Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing decades later, described witnessing crowds gasp in genuine astonishment as cranes were used to make these enormous animals seem to appear and vanish through the arena floor as if by supernatural magic. A typical full day of Roman games followed a carefully structured and deliberately escalating rhythm designed to maximize dramatic emotional impact across the entire audience experience. The morning began with the Venationese, the staged animal hunts, offering spectators a thrilling but relatively lighter opening act before the day's darker events unfolded. At midday, the mood shifted dramatically, as this period was traditionally reserved for public executions, including the brutal Dammatio ad Bestias, a segment so consistently grim that many wealthier Roman spectators reportedly left the arena during the lunch interval specifically to avoid witnessing it, leaving the midday executions to be watched primarily by the poorer members of the crowd who remained in their seats. Finally, in the afternoon, came the main event that most Romans had truly come to see: the gladiatorial combats themselves, carefully paced and ordered by the presiding editor to build toward the single most anticipated and prestigious matchup, saved deliberately for last. According to later Roman legend, though extensively debated among modern historians regarding its precise factual accuracy, the very first duel ever fought within the newly completed Colosseum during Titus's opening games in 80 AD pitted two gladiators named Priscus and Verus against one another in a contest so evenly matched and so fiercely fought that neither man could ultimately be declared the victor. Recognizing the extraordinary courage both fighters had displayed, Titus reportedly awarded both men the wooden rudies, symbolically granting both gladiators their freedom simultaneously, a dramatic and carefully calculated act of imperial generosity intended to set exactly the right emotional tone for the historic games that followed. Among the most celebrated gladiators of an earlier generation was a fighter named Spiculus, who so thoroughly impressed the Emperor Nero with his combat skill that Nero reportedly showered him with land, wealth, and luxurious houses typically reserved only for Rome's most distinguished military commanders. A striking illustration of just how far a gladiator's fame could occasionally elevate him within Roman society. However socially disgraced his formal profession technically remained. Beyond the animal hunts known as venesations, Titus also staged mock naval battles called naumachia, reportedly flooding the arena floor itself using a complex system of underground channels and aqueducts to stage full-scale ship combat in front of the roaring crowd. The logistics required to flood an entire arena, sail actual warships across it, and then drain the water fast enough to prepare for the next day's events remain, even by modern engineering standards, a genuinely remarkable feat of ancient infrastructure. And at the heart of it all stood the gladiators themselves. Professional fighters trained in specialized schools called ludi, whose combat skill, physical suffering, and occasional survival formed the true emotional core of the entire Roman spectacle. Upon entering formal gladiatorial training, fighters were required to swear a chilling and legally binding oath known as the Sacramentum Gladiatorium, formally consenting to be burned, bound in chains, beaten with rods, and killed by the sword should their training or performance ever fail to meet the required standard. This extraordinary oath, recorded by the Roman writer Petronius, meant that a gladiator formally surrendered many of the basic legal protections an ordinary Roman citizen could otherwise expect, voluntarily placing his own body entirely under the absolute authority of his trainers and eventual owners for the full duration of his contracted service. Contrary to popular modern assumption, most gladiators were not simply condemned criminals thrown randomly into the arena to die. Many were highly trained professional fighters, some of them slaves, but others surprisingly free citizens who voluntarily signed contracts trading their own personal freedom for fame, money, and the intense adoration of the Roman crowd. Gladiators trained for years under professional instructors known as lanistae, learning specific fighting styles tied to specialized equipment and weaponry, each type carrying its own distinct tactical role and dramatic visual identity. The largest and most famous of these training facilities, known as the Ludus Magnus, stood directly adjacent to the Colosseum itself, connected to the arena through a dedicated underground tunnel that allowed fighters to move directly from their barracks into the hypogeum below the arena floor without ever being seen in public beforehand. Life inside a gladiatorial school followed a rigid and highly disciplined daily routine, with fighters woken before dawn for intensive physical conditioning, weapons drills against wooden practice posts called palace, and carefully managed nutrition designed to build both muscle mass and the protective layer of fat believed to reduce the severity of sword wounds during actual combat. This specific high-carbohydrate diet, consisting heavily of barley, beans, and dried fruit, earned gladiators the informal nickname hordearii, meaning barley eaters, and modern isotopic analysis of skeletal remains recovered from an ancient gladiator cemetery in Ephesus has confirmed this distinctive diet with remarkable scientific precision. This same Ephesus excavation, examined extensively by Austrian forensic researchers, uncovered dozens of gladiator skeletons showing clear evidence of expertly healed combat wounds, indicating that injured fighters frequently received genuinely skilled medical treatment, further supporting the idea that gladiators represented valuable assets worth the considerable expense of professional medical care rather than simply disposable bodies discarded after a single unlucky appearance. Forensic examination of these same remains also revealed something else entirely unexpected. precise and remarkably consistent wound patterns, suggesting that many gladiatorial deaths followed a formalized, almost ritualized killing technique, a single controlled blow delivered to a defeated and already subdued opponent, rather than the chaotic and random violence often depicted in modern popular film and television. Gladiator schools operated under strict and highly organized management, with individual fighters representing significant financial investments for their owners, meaning that despite the arena's obvious brutality, a skilled gladiator's life carried genuine economic value that owners had strong practical incentive to protect and preserve wherever possible. Staging a formal set of gladiatorial games, known in Latin as munera, represented an enormous financial undertaking, and the individual sponsoring the event, called the editor, was expected to personally cover the substantial costs of renting or purchasing fighters, feeding and housing animals, and paying skilled arena staff, all in exchange for the immense public prestige and political goodwill that a successful and memorable spectacle could generate. For an emperor acting as editor, this arrangement created a direct and continuous financial pressure to maintain public approval through spectacle, since a disappointing or insufficiently lavish set of games could genuinely damage an emperor's public standing, while an especially generous and memorable show could meaningfully strengthen his position among the very citizens whose continued loyalty he depended upon. This dynamic meant that behind every roaring afternoon of combat lay months of careful financial planning, negotiation with gladiator schools and animal suppliers, and constant political calculation regarding exactly how much violence and generosity would be required to keep the Roman public satisfied without bankrupting the imperial treasury in the process. Wealthy private citizens outside the imperial family also occasionally sponsored smaller munera of their own, particularly in provincial cities across the empire, using the same basic logic of public generosity in exchange for political and social prestige that motivated the emperor himself, a practice that meant gladiatorial spectacle functioned simultaneously as imperial propaganda at the highest level and as ordinary local politics at the level of individual Roman towns and municipal councils. This economic reality meant that the popular modern image of gladiators as endlessly disposable slaves facing certain death in every single appearance significantly oversimplifies the actual practice, since a well-trained and popular fighter represented years of costly investment that no rational owner wished to see wasted needlessly. Roman law and custom also recognized a distinct category of female gladiators, known as gladiatrices, who periodically appeared in the arena despite considerable social controversy and eventual formal restriction, evidence that even Rome's most rigid social hierarchies occasionally bent under the arena's relentless demand for novelty and spectacle. A relief carving discovered at Halicarnassus depicting two female fighters named Amazon and Achilia locked in armed combat remains one of the only surviving physical depictions of this genuinely surprising dimension of Roman arena culture, a detail modern popular imagination of ancient Rome frequently overlooks entirely. The Emperor Septimius Severus eventually banned female gladiatorial combat entirely around 200 AD, reportedly concerned that the practice had become an embarrassing spectacle, undermining traditional Roman standards of feminine social respectability, a ban that effectively ended this particular chapter of arena history for good. The heavily armored secutor, designed specifically to hunt and defeat the lightly armed retiarius, who fought instead with only a net, a trident, and speed as his primary defense, created one of the most visually iconic and dramatically satisfying combat pairings in the entire history of the arena. The Thrax, armed with a small curved sword and equipped with distinctive high greaves protecting the legs, and the Mamillo, a heavily armored fighter carrying a large rectangular shield reminiscent of Roman legionary equipment, represented two more of the many specialized combat archetypes Roman audiences came to know intimately and passionately debate. Beyond these well-known categories, Roman arenas also featured the equites, who began each combat mounted on horseback before dismounting to continue fighting on foot, the Demacharos, who fought unusually wielding a curved blade in each hand simultaneously, and the bestiarii, specialist fighters trained specifically to hunt and battle dangerous wild animals rather than facing other human opponents. Each of these distinct fighting styles carried its own specialized training regimen, equipment, and even distinctive helmet design, allowing experienced Roman spectators to instantly recognize which type of matchup they were about to witness the moment the fighters emerged from the underground tunnels into the arena's blinding daylight. This economic and social paradox sat at the very heart of gladiatorial culture throughout Roman history. Under Roman law, gladiators were formally classified alongside actors, prostitutes, and other disreputable professions under a legal status known as infamia, stripping them of many basic civic rights and marking them as permanently disgraced in the eyes of respectable Roman society. And yet, simultaneously, a genuinely skilled and popular gladiator could achieve a level of public celebrity that rivaled or even exceeded that of Rome's most distinguished senators and generals. A contradiction that reveals how thoroughly the arena had created its own separate and parallel system of fame, one operating according to entirely different rules than the formal social hierarchy governing the rest of Roman civic life. Roman crowds developed genuine emotional attachments to individual gladiators, much like modern sports fans idolize professional athletes, tracking their win records, favorite techniques, and personal reputations with obsessive enthusiasm. Graffiti discovered on the walls of Pompeii, preserved by the very volcanic eruption that destroyed the city, records ordinary Roman citizens boasting about their favorite fighters. One particular inscription proudly declaring a gladiator named Celadus to be the object of every girl's desire, a startlingly human and relatable detail surviving across nearly 2,000 years of history. Additional graffiti recovered from Pompeii records detailed personal win and loss statistics for individual named gladiators, tracked with the same statistical enthusiasm modern sports fans might apply to a favorite athlete's career record, alongside crude sketches of specific combat matchups, demonstrating that arena culture had penetrated deeply into the everyday casual conversation of ordinary Roman citizens, living even in smaller provincial towns, far removed from the Colosseum itself. Indeed, the Colosseum, however famous and iconic it remains today, represented only the largest and most prestigious example of a building type that Roman authorities constructed in some form across virtually every significant city throughout the empire, from Britain to North Africa to the Eastern Mediterranean, meaning that gladiatorial spectacle culture was never confined to Rome alone, but instead functioned as a genuinely empire-wide shared cultural institution, binding together an enormously diverse population spanning Thranance, the amphitheater at El Gem in modern Tunisia, at Verona in northern Italy, and at Nimes in southern France, all still stand today as surviving testaments to just how thoroughly this particular form of public entertainment architecture spread throughout the furthest reaches of Roman territorial control. Each provincial arena built smaller than the Colosseum itself, but following remarkably similar architectural and functional principles. Contrary to another popular modern myth, gladiatorial combat did not always end in death. Many fights were governed by strict rules, overseen by referees, and a defeated but skilled fighter who had demonstrated genuine courage could often be spared at the crowd's request. A decision ultimately made by the presiding editor of the games, frequently the emperor himself. The famous gesture of thumbs up or thumbs down, so deeply embedded in modern popular imagination through film and television, likely did not function exactly as commonly depicted, with historians still debating the precise meaning and physical form of the actual Roman gesture used to spare or condemn a defeated fighter. Roman spectators did not simply watch passively either. Betting on individual gladiatorial combats was widespread and enthusiastic across every level of Roman society, with ordinary citizens wagering money, food, and personal possessions on their favorite fighters, much as modern audiences might bet on a professional boxing match. Surviving Roman writings describe the arena as a place of genuinely electric social energy, where senators, merchants, laborers, and slaves all shared the same physical space. However rigidly segregated by seating tier, united temporarily by shared anticipation, collective roars of approval, and sudden gasps of horror at each unexpected turn of combat. The Roman poet Martial, writing specifically about the Colosseum's opening games, composed an entire collection of poems celebrating the spectacle, describing individual bouts, praising the Emperor Titus's generosity, and capturing in vivid detail exactly how contemporary Romans experienced and discussed these violent public performances among themselves. The intensity of Roman crowd passions surrounding arena spectacle could occasionally spill over into genuine real-world violence beyond the arena floor itself. In the city of Pompeii, A violent riot broke out in 59 AD between local spectators and visitors from a rival neighboring town during a gladiatorial event, escalating into deadly street fighting so serious that the Roman Senate formally banned that particular amphitheater from hosting any further games for a full decade as punishment. This dramatic episode, recorded by the Roman historian Tacitus and later confirmed through surviving wall paintings discovered at Pompeii itself, illustrates that the emotional intensity generated by arena spectacle was never confined neatly within the amphitheater's own walls, but frequently carried real and sometimes dangerous consequences into the wider social and political life of the surrounding Roman community. Even Roman writers who personally expressed private moral discomfort with the arena's extreme violence rarely called for its outright abolition. The philosopher and statesman Seneca famously described witnessing a midday execution spectacle with evident personal horror, writing that he returned home from the arena feeling more cruel and less humane simply for having watched, yet the institution itself continued entirely unaffected by such individual moral objections for centuries afterward. Among the many gladiators whose names survive in the historical record, one figure stands out with particular and haunting significance: a Syrian-born fighter named Flama, whose story illustrates the strange and complicated psychology that the arena could create even within its own victims. Flama fought an extraordinary 34 recorded combats during his career, an almost unheard of number of appearances for a profession where survival itself was never guaranteed from one fight to the next. According to surviving inscriptions, Flama was offered his freedom, the wooden training sword known as the rudis that symbolized formal release from gladiatorial service, on no fewer than 4 separate occasions throughout his career. Astonishingly, Flama refused his own freedom every single time, choosing instead to remain within the arena, continuing to fight and continuing to risk death in pursuit of glory, fame, and the intoxicating adoration of the Roman crowd. His story reveals something profoundly unsettling about the psychological grip the arena could exert, even over the very men whose lives it constantly threatened. For some gladiators, the roar of tens of thousands of spectators had become more valuable than freedom itself. Flama eventually died in the arena, at around the age of 30, his memorial stone recording his extraordinary combat record with clear and evident pride. A permanent monument to a life entirely consumed by the very spectacle that Rome had built to entertain itself. As the decades following the Colosseum's opening progressed, successive emperors continued using the arena as a crucial political tool, understanding instinctively what Vespasian had first recognized, that public spectacle and personal political survival were now permanently and inseparably linked. Titus himself would not live long to enjoy the enormous public goodwill his opening games had generated. He died suddenly in 81 AD, only 2 years into his reign, from a fever whose exact cause still remains uncertain to modern historians, leaving the throne and the still relatively new Colosseum to his younger brother. The Emperor Domitian, Vespasian's younger son and Titus's eventual successor, expanded the games even further, reportedly staging combats between dwarfs and even between women, novelty spectacles designed specifically to keep an increasingly demanding Roman public entertained with ever more shocking and unprecedented forms of violence. Domitian also added the Hypogean's most extensive underground modifications, expanding the network of tunnels and animal enclosures beneath the arena floor to allow for increasingly elaborate and unpredictable staged spectacles. This pattern of escalation would continue to define the Colosseum's operation for generations, a recurring and ultimately unsustainable dynamic in which each new emperor felt compelled to outdo his predecessor's spectacle in order to maintain the crowd's loyalty and attention. Perhaps no single emperor demonstrated this escalating pattern more dramatically than Trajan, who ruled Rome roughly 3 decades after Domitian, following his decisive military conquest of the Dacian kingdom in what is now modern Romania. To celebrate this enormous territorial and military triumph, Trajan staged games lasting an almost unimaginable 123 consecutive days, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, during which as many as 10,000 gladiators fought and roughly 11,000 animals were killed across the extended celebration. These numbers, if accurate, represent the single largest gladiatorial spectacle ever recorded in Roman history. An event so vast in scale that modern historians still debate exactly how Roman logistics of the period could feasibly support housing, feeding, and staging combat for such an enormous number of fighters and animals across 4 consecutive months. Whatever the precise accuracy of these staggering ancient figures, Trajan's Dacian triumph games illustrate with unmistakable clarity just how deeply intertwined military conquest, imperial propaganda, and arena spectacle had become within Roman political culture by the height of the empire's power and territorial expansion. Perhaps no single figure illustrates the arena's strange and dangerous psychological pull over Roman political life more dramatically than the Emperor Commodus, who ruled Rome roughly a century after the Colosseum's original construction. Unlike previous emperors, who typically presided over the games from the safety of the imperial box, Commodus became personally and directly obsessed with the arena itself, reportedly entering the Colosseum floor himself, fighting as a gladiator in front of the astonished Roman public. Roman historians recorded with evident horror and disbelief that Commodus fought and killed exotic animals personally, including reportedly slaughtering elephants and ostriches with his own hands, while demanding enormous sums of money from the Roman treasury for what he considered his own personal gladiatorial performances. This behavior, an emperor voluntarily lowering himself to the social status of a gladiator, represented a profound and deeply shocking violation of traditional Roman aristocratic values, since gladiators, despite the adoration some individually received, remained formally classified among the lowest and most disgraced ranks of Roman society. Cassius Dio, who personally witnessed several of Commodus's arena performances as a member of the Roman Senate, recorded his own genuine terror during these events, describing how the emperor would sometimes decapitate an ostrich and then approach the senators seated in the front row, holding the bloody severed head aloft and grinning menacingly, a silent but unmistakable threat that senators reportedly had to suppress their own laughter and fear simultaneously, chewing on laurel leaves plucked from their ceremonial wreaths to hide their trembling lips from the what's from Mankfops facetious. Commodus additionally renamed the city of Rome itself after his own personal gladiatorial title and even renamed a Colosseum in his own honor for a brief period, a level of egotistical self-glorification that alarmed even Rome's most loyal supporters and ultimately helped convince his own inner circle that his continued rule had become an intolerable danger to the stability of the empire itself. Commodus's obsession with the arena ultimately contributed directly to his own downfall, as members of his own inner circle, alarmed by his increasingly erratic and dangerous behavior, eventually conspired against him, and he was assassinated in 192 AD, strangled in his own bath by a wrestler hired specifically for the task. The very spectacle that had once secured imperial legitimacy for Vespasian had, within just over a century, become a destabilizing personal obsession capable of destroying an emperor's own political survival, a pattern that would continue to complicate the relationship between Roman rulers and the arena for generations still to come. Beyond the gladiators and emperors, the Colosseum's daily operation required an enormous and highly organized logistical apparatus, one of the ancient world's most sophisticated entertainment industries, functioning with remarkable scale and complexity centuries before anything comparable would exist again. Exotic animals were captured and transported from across the entire breadth of the Roman Empire, lions and leopards from North Africa, bears from the forests of northern Europe, and even crocodiles from Egypt, creating supply chains stretching thousands of miles, specifically to satisfy Rome's insatiable demand for novel and terrifying spectacle. Historians estimate that over the roughly 4 centuries the Colosseum remained in active use, several 100,000 animals were killed within its walls, a staggering ecological impact that some modern researchers argue may have contributed to the localized extinction of certain large predator populations across parts of North Africa and the Middle East. Capturing and transporting these animals required an entire specialized industry stretching across the far reaches of the Roman world, with professional trappers venturing deep into the deserts and forests of Africa, the Middle East, and Northern Europe to capture lions, leopards, bears, and other dangerous creatures alive, a task carrying enormous personal risk long before the animals ever reached the arena itself. Once captured, animals were transported by cart and by specially constructed ships, often over distances of well over 1,000 miles, kept in cages and fed at considerable ongoing expense throughout the difficult and frequently fatal journey toward Rome, meaning that a significant percentage of captured animals likely died from stress, injury, or malnutrition before ever reaching the arena floor at all. The financial cost of sourcing exotic animals for a single major spectacle could be extraordinary, with certain rare creatures such as tigers or rhinoceroses commanding prices roughly equivalent to the annual income of a wealthy Roman household, meaning that a truly lavish series of games represented a staggering personal or imperial financial investment. This voracious ongoing demand for exotic and dangerous animals eventually led Roman authorities to establish dedicated holding facilities near major ports and along key trade routes specifically to manage and coordinate this vast and logistically complex international supply chain, feeding Rome's endless appetite for novelty and spectacle. The human cost proved equally staggering. Modern historical estimates suggest that somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 people died within the Colosseum's arena across its centuries of continuous operation, a number that dwarfs the death toll of almost any other single structure in recorded human history. Among those killed were condemned criminals, executed through deliberately theatrical and brutal methods, including being thrown to wild animals, a punishment known as damnatio et bestias, specifically designed to serve as both public entertainment and a horrifying deterrent against crime. Roman authorities also staged elaborate execution spectacles drawing directly on scenes from popular mythology, forcing condemned prisoners to reenact famous mythological deaths, sometimes involving elaborate stage sets, costumes, and choreographed scenarios, blending genuine judicial execution with theatrical performance in a manner that modern audiences frequently find difficult to fully comprehend. The Roman poet Martial described one such spectacle in vivid and unsettling detail, describing a condemned criminal forced to play the role of the mythological figure Orpheus, ultimately torn apart by a real bear in front of the cheering crowd, blurring the line between judicial punishment, mythological performance, and pure spectacle entertainment in a way entirely unique to Roman arena culture. This punishment was also, according to numerous surviving early Christian and Roman historical sources, used against members of the early Christian community during periods of state-sponsored religious persecution, transforming the arena into a site of profound religious martyrdom that would shape its symbolic meaning for centuries to come. Modern historians continue to actively debate the precise scale and specific historical accuracy of Christian martyrdom occurring directly within the Colosseum itself, since detailed contemporary Roman administrative records documenting such executions at this particular site have not survived in the numbers many later Christian traditions would eventually claim. Many modern historians point out that most documented executions of Christians during the persecutions under emperors such as Nero and Diocletian more likely took place at smaller venues across the empire or at Rome's other execution grounds, rather than specifically and exclusively within the Colosseum itself, since surviving contemporary Christian martyrdom accounts rarely name the Flavian amphitheater with the same specificity later medieval tradition would eventually name the Flavian amphitheater with the same specificity later medieval tradition would have eventually held. What remains historically undisputed, however, is that the broader practice of public execution as entertainment was a genuine and deeply embedded feature of Roman arena culture, regardless of the exact specific religious identity of every individual victim killed within the Colosseum's walls across the centuries. This uncomfortable historical ambiguity has not prevented the Colosseum from becoming, particularly from the medieval period onward, one of the most powerful and enduring symbolic sites of early Christian martyrdom within the broader tradition of Western religious and cultural memory. As the Roman Empire itself began entering a period of prolonged political and economic instability during the 3rd century AD, the scale and frequency of the Colosseum spectacles gradually began to change, though the arena itself remained in continuous and active use for many generations still to come. The Roman satirist Juvenal, writing during the same general period, famously criticized what he saw as the ordinary Roman citizens' declining civic ambition, observing bitterly that the Roman public now cared about only 2 things above all else: bread and circuses, a phrase that has survived more than 19 centuries as a lasting shorthand for any political strategy, relying on cheap food and mass entertainment to pacify and distract an increasingly powerless citizenry. This phrase captures with remarkable precision exactly what Vespasian had first understood when he built the Colosseum, and exactly what every subsequent emperor continued to rely upon across the following centuries, that a well-fed and well-entertained Roman public rarely posed a serious political threat to whoever currently held imperial power. Successive earthquakes, a recurring natural hazard in the region surrounding Rome, periodically damaged portions of the massive structure, requiring repeated rounds of imperial-funded repair and reconstruction throughout the arena's long operational history, including significant recorded damage following a major earthquake in 847 AD, long after the building's original gladiatorial function had already ceased entirely. An inscription discovered at the site records extensive repairs undertaken during the 5th century AD, funded by a Roman senator, evidence that even as the wider Western Roman Empire itself was crumbling under mounting external and internal pressure, the Colosseum remained sufficiently important to Roman civic identity to warrant continued significant investment. The formal tradition of gladiatorial combat itself began facing increasing moral and religious criticism as Christianity gradually became the dominant religion of the Roman state, following the conversion of the Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century AD. According to a well-known historical tradition, though modern historians continue to debate regarding its precise factual accuracy, a Christian monk named Telemachus reportedly leapt into the arena in the early 5th century AD to physically stop a gladiatorial combat and was killed by the enraged crowd for his intervention, an act that supposedly so horrified the Emperor Honorius that he formally banned gladiatorial games shortly afterward. Whatever the precise historical accuracy of this particular dramatic legend, the Emperor Honorius did indeed issue a formal edict banning gladiatorial combat around 404 AD, marking the beginning of the end for one of Rome's most iconic and enduring cultural institutions. Animal hunts, the Venationese, continued for several more decades beyond this formal ban on human gladiatorial combat, with the very last recorded official animal hunt staged within the Colosseum occurring around 523 AD under the authority of a Roman senator named Anicius Maximus, more than 4 centuries after the arena had first opened its doors to the Roman public. By this point, the wider Western Roman Empire had already formally collapsed, and the city of Rome itself, once the unrivaled center of an empire spanning 3 continents, had entered a long period of dramatic political decline, economic contraction, and steadily shrinking population. The Colosseum, no longer serving its original function as a stage for imperial spectacle, gradually began a long and undignified transformation, repurposed across the following centuries for an entirely different and far less glamorous set of practical human uses. During the medieval period, portions of the structure were converted into housing, small workshops, and even a fortified stronghold controlled by competing powerful Roman noble families who recognized the practical defensive value of the arena's massive surviving stone walls. The powerful Frangipani family took direct control of the Colosseum during the 12th century, fortifying its ancient arches and converting the structure into a private castle used repeatedly during the violent factional conflicts that characterized medieval Roman politics. A striking transformation for a building originally designed purely for public spectacle. By this point, ordinary Romans living in the shadow of the crumbling arena had largely lost any detailed understanding of the structure's original purpose, with medieval folklore instead reimagining the ruins as the site of ancient pagan temple worship, or even, according to some persistent local legends, as a place haunted by demons and evil spirits, drawn to the memory of so much historical bloodshed. Vegetation gradually took root within the structure's weathered stone crevices over these centuries of neglect, and by the 18th century, naturalists catalogued hundreds of distinct plant species growing wild throughout the ruins, an unintended botanical garden created entirely by centuries of abandonment and slow structural decay. Despite this long physical decline, the Colosseum's symbolic power over the Roman imagination never fully disappeared. An English monk named Bede, writing around the 8th century AD, recorded a popular saying already circulating among Roman pilgrims of his own time, declaring that while the Colosseum stands, Rome shall stand. And when the Colosseum falls, Rome shall fall, and when Rome falls, the world shall fall. A prophecy revealing just how deeply the ruined arena had already become fused with the very identity and fate of the city itself, even centuries after its original gladiatorial had been forgotten. During the 16th century, Pope Sixtus V briefly proposed converting the ancient ruins into a wool processing factory, intended to provide employment for Rome's poor, an ambitious plan that was ultimately abandoned following the Pope's death before construction could meaningfully begin, sparing the ancient structure from what would have been an almost unimaginable transformation from imperial killing ground to industrial workshop. A catastrophic earthquake struck Rome in 1349, causing the dramatic and irreversible collapse of the entire southern outer wall of the Colosseum, a section of the structure that has never since been rebuilt and remains visibly absent from the ruins that survive today. Following this earthquake, the enormous quantities of fallen stone and marble were extensively and systematically scavenged by local Romans, quarried directly for use in constructing numerous other prominent buildings across the city, including, remarkably, portions of St. Peter's Basilica itself, the central church of the Roman Catholic faith. This meant that the very stones once used to construct a monument specifically dedicated to pagan Roman imperial spectacle were eventually repurposed to help build one of Christianity's most sacred and significant religious structures. A striking historical irony spanning well over 1,000 years of continuous transformation. By the 18th century, growing recognition of the Colosseum's profound historical and cultural significance finally began reversing this centuries-long pattern of gradual destruction and stone scavenging, as successive popes took direct action to formally protect and preserve the arena's dramatically weathered remaining structure. Pope Benedict XIV formally consecrated the site in 1749, specifically citing the widespread, if historically contested, tradition of early Christian martyrdom believed to have occurred there, and installing a series of commemorative shrine stations around the arena's interior perimeter that survive in various forms to the present day. Systematic archaeological excavation of the Colosseum's long-hidden underground hypogeum began in earnest during the 19th century, led significantly by the Italian archaeologist Pietro Rosa, working under the patronage of the French Emperor Napoleon III, gradually revealing to modern historians and engineers the full, extraordinary complexity of the ancient mechanical systems that had once made the arena's most dramatic and unpredictable spectacles physically possible. During the 20th century, the Italian fascist government under Benito Mussolini took a particular and politically calculated interest in the Colosseum, actively promoting the ruined arena as a powerful symbolic connection between his own regime and the imagined glory of ancient imperial Rome, incorporating the monument extensively into state propaganda imagery and constructing a broad new ceremonial boulevard, specifically designed to showcase the ancient structure to maximum dramatic effect. This deliberate political appropriation of the Colosseum's imagery illustrates yet another chapter in the building's remarkably long history of serving as a tool for political legitimacy, echoing, however uncomfortably, the very same basic function Vespasian had first envisioned for the structure nearly 2,000 years earlier. These ongoing archaeological efforts have continued well into the modern era, with a major restoration project completed in 2016, conducting an extensive multi-year cleaning of the structure's exterior facade, removing nearly 2,000 years of accumulated pollution, grime, and structural decay. Remarkably, this multi-million-dollar restoration project was funded not by the Italian government directly, but through a private corporate sponsorship arrangement with the luxury shoe and leather goods company Tod's, an unusual but historically fitting modern echo of the way ancient wealthy patrons had once funded lavish public spectacles specifically to attach their own name and reputation to a beloved public institution. More recent engineering proposals have even explored the ambitious possibility of installing a new retractable arena floor, allowing visitors to once again look directly down into the same hypogeum tunnels where caged animals and condemned prisoners once waited in darkness before being violently thrust upward into the blinding daylight above. The Colosseum's cultural influence extends today far beyond the physical ruins themselves, shaping how modern popular culture continues to imagine ancient Rome as a whole. From blockbuster films depicting fictional gladiatorial combat to the very word arena itself, which has entered common English usage to describe any large competitive stage, political or otherwise, a linguistic legacy directly inherited from this single ancient Roman structure. Modern Italian authorities have periodically illuminated the Colosseum in symbolic colors to mark significant global events, including using the monument's ancient walls to campaign publicly against capital punishment worldwide, an intentional and pointed historical irony given the structure's own long and brutal history as one of history's most prolific sites of public execution. Every time a nation somewhere in the world commutes a death sentence or formally abolishes capital punishment, the Colosseum's ancient travertine walls are illuminated in gold, a modern tradition begun by the city of Rome in 1999, transforming a building once defined entirely by state-sanctioned killing into an unlikely global symbol, advocating against exactly that same practice nearly 2 millennia later. Today, the Colosseum stands as one of the most visited historical monuments anywhere on the entire planet, drawing more than 6 million visitors annually. Ordinary people from virtually every nation on Earth walking through the same weathered stone corridors where Roman citizens once gathered by the tens of thousands to witness organized, systematic human and animal slaughter as a normal and expected form of everyday public entertainment. Looking back across nearly 2,000 years of continuous history, from Vespasian's calculated political decision to drain a hated tyrant's private lake, through a full century of escalating imperial spectacle, to an emperor's own obsessive and ultimately fatal personal descent into the arena, and finally, to centuries of slow decay, scavenging and eventual careful modern preservation, a clear and unmistakable historical pattern emerges. The Colosseum was never simply a building. It was a physical machine specifically engineered to manufacture political legitimacy through carefully orchestrated public spectacle, a machine so effective that it would continue operating in some form for nearly 4.5 centuries, and so symbolically powerful that its ruins still shape how the entire modern world imagines the nature of Roman civilization itself. Its story reveals a profoundly uncomfortable but historically enduring truth about the deep relationship between power and public entertainment, that rulers throughout history have repeatedly discovered the same essential lesson Vespasian first understood standing beside Nero's drained golden lake, that a crowd sufficiently entertained will rarely stop to ask difficult questions about who is truly ruling over them and why. And yet the Colosseum's story is not only a story about rulers and the crowds they manipulated. It is equally the story of the hundreds of thousands of individual human beings, gladiators, condemned prisoners, and captured animal handlers alike, whose names have almost entirely vanished from history, remembered collectively only through the scale of their suffering rather than as the individual human lives they actually once were. Men like Flamma, who chose the roar of the crowd over his own freedom, and the countless nameless fighters who left behind no inscription at all, remind us that behind every staggering ancient statistic recorded by Roman historians stood a real person, facing real fear, in a building specifically engineered to transform that fear into public entertainment for tens of thousands of watching strangers. Nearly 2,000 years later, the Colosseum's weathered arches still draw millions of visitors annually, no longer to witness bloodshed, but to stand within the same ancient walls and quietly confront one of history's most unsettling and enduring questions: how easily an entire civilization could organize itself around the systematic entertainment value of human suffering, and how carefully any society, ancient or modern, must continue guarding against that same seductive and deeply human temptation today.